All right, last time we left off talking a little bit about atoms, and there are a bunch of different atoms, but remember they're all made up of the same basic parts, which are protons, electrons, and neutrons, and different atoms just have different numbers of those. And remember, we also said that for what we're going to do in an ecology course, we don't really need to know every atom out there. We only need to know a couple. So some of those are hydrogen, carbon, oxygen, and nitrogen. And then we talked a little bit about the different breakdowns of, say, how many are in each of each atom, for example, in, say, a human. But this differs by animal. So a certain amount of oxygen, carbon, so forth, and things of that sort. And then we talked about the fact that what atoms sometimes do, and we didn't go into detail on this, but sometimes they will share the electrons with one another, and there are reasons why that happens, and you don't need to know that. But when they share electrons, they end up forming this little bond between two atoms, and that bond is called a covalent bond. And then we talked about the fact that you can hook a bunch of atoms together into these really big molecules, and those are called macromolecules. And there's a couple of different ones, but the one I want to talk about today in a little more detail is the macromolecule called an amino acid, which has, the amino acid has 2 or 3 parts to it, and 2 that are really significant in terms of why we call it an amino acid. So the first is this thing called an amino group, which is a nitrogen and 2 hydrogens. And the next is this group called a carboxylic group, which is a carbon with an oxygen and a hydrogen, and then a double bound oxygen. Now, that carboxylic part sometimes falls apart, and that's what ends up making what we call that thing an acid. But you don't need to really know what an amino group is or a carboxylic group. What you need to know instead is more simply that an amino acid is made up of a couple of these parts, which include nitrogen, carbon, and oxygen. Over here, you can see that in living organisms, there are 20 different amino acids, and all those amino acids used in one way or another end up making our proteins. The R that you see here, that just simply means that's where the amino acids are different. So if you look at glycine here, for example, it has a hydrogen on it. And if you look at alanine, it has a carbon and a hydrogen on it. And so as you go through, each amino acid is just different based on what's attached to what we call that R group there. You don't need to know all 20 amino acids or anything like that, just that there's 20 different ones and we use them to build things. Now, what we're going to do is hook 2 amino acids together with another covalent bond. So here you can see one, and then it's attached to another one. So you have 2 amino acids that are connected. Now, 2 amino acids together, not going to do all that much. So what we need to do is we need to then hook a whole bunch more of those together, and those will fold up into a big structure that we end up calling a protein. Proteins do a couple of different things. One is they form what are called structural proteins. So your fingernails, for example, are made out of a protein called keratin. It's also the same protein that makes up a horn of a rhino. Proteins are important for muscle and collagen and other things of that sort. But the part we're going to focus on mostly is that proteins are very important because they work as enzymes. So enzymes are a type of protein. They're going to speed up chemical reactions. And so let's use an example to illustrate this point. Let's say you had a hard day at school, and so you went home and you made a bunch of chocolate chip cookies, and they're all right out of the oven. They look delicious, and we're going to eat these chocolate chip cookies here. And what better item to wash down chocolate chip cookies than a big ice cold glass of milk with those chocolate chip cookies? Some of you will end up like this here, and it won't be nearly as nice for some of you as others. Now, why is that? Well, what happens is there is this enzyme. Okay, in this particular case, the enzyme is called lactase, but almost every chemical reaction going on in the body has some kind of enzyme. So in this particular case, there's an enzyme called lactase, and what lactase does is it can take the sugar, lactose, and it can break that sugar down And when it does that, you no longer have lactose because you've broken it down into smaller sugars. People that have this enzyme functioning in them can digest milk. Those that don't make that enzyme, it doesn't work so well, and you end up with stomach problems. So in that particular case, what we did there is we took a sugar called lactose and we broke it down using the enzyme lactase, and that's how we broke down the sugar that was in milk. In a human body or any living organism, there's all kinds of reactions happening, not just that one, but instead many happening inside a cell and all over the organism, depending on the organism and whatnot. The collective sum of all the chemical reactions happening inside a living organism, that term we use to describe that is called metabolism, and that's a term you're probably familiar with when you talk about a person having a high metabolism or a low metabolism. Instead of looking at every single chemical reaction, which would be more what one would do in like a biochemistry course, we're just going to point out two really big sets of chemical reactions, and these are biochemical reactions that happen all over the place, and in this first one happens basically in every cell, and it's called cellular respiration. And if you look over here, you can see there are a whole bunch of steps, and each of these little green lines there, in which, for example, glucose gets turned into glucose 6-phosphate, and then glucose 6-phosphate gets turned into fructose 6-phosphate. Each of those little green arrows has an enzyme that helps make each of those reactions occur. So as you can see, this is very complex, and there are many steps and many enzymes that make this run. But what you really need to get, we're going to convert the energy that's stored in the covalent bonds, we're going to convert that into a different kind of chemical energy called ATP, because nearly every cell reaction that needs energy happens to run on a chemical called ATP. That stands for adenosine triphosphate, and you can just think of that as a molecule that's very high in energy, and you can kind of use that energy anywhere. So what goes into these reactions? Well, one is glucose and the other is oxygen, and those go in to make the reactions occur. And it's important to kind of remember those inputs and outputs, but you don't need to remember all the details of that. The thing that comes out of cell respiration is water comes out of that reaction when you're done, ATP, which is the most important part, and also a molecule called carbon dioxide, which you're familiar with also most likely, and that is a waste product. It just comes out of the reaction after it's done. All living things do cell respiration or something very similar to it. So we'll just go ahead and say that it's an important part in all living things because that's how they utilize energy. Another set of reactions that is important, but it doesn't happen in every living thing, is called photosynthesis. And you've heard of this, I'm sure, before too. And what photosynthesis is, it's a set of chemical reactions in which we can take sunlight energy, capture that energy using a special molecule called chlorophyll, and we can use the chlorophyll energy that we've captured in the sunlight, and along with carbon dioxide, we can use that to make glucose. Once again, there's a whole bunch of steps, and you don't need to worry about those. Instead, if you think about what goes in, sunlight, carbon dioxide, and water, those are inputs. What comes out of that is sugar and oxygen. Plants do photosynthesis, of course, and cell respiration, but not everything can do photosynthesis. Animals, for example, don't do photosynthesis. Plants do, and a couple of other things we'll mention as we go. So a couple basic concepts just in review to make sure you understand. Today we talked about taking atoms and hooking them together and making amino acids, and then we took our amino acids and hooked those together to make proteins. There are a lot of different kinds of proteins, but at a functional level, the proteins can act in many cases as enzymes to help control chemical reactions. There are two chemical reactions that we're going to utilize in here a lot. One is cell respiration and one is photosynthesis. There are many other chemical reactions, but we can just focus on those two because we can do so much with understanding ecology by knowing those two. Okay? All right. I hope everyone's having a good day, and I will talk to you soon.